Welcome to DOC NYC's inaugural Spring Showcase, our mid-year celebration of documentary films and series. I'm Brandon Harrison, features programmer here at DOC NYC, and it's my pleasure to be speaking with executive producers Alice Keens-Soper and Mike Gunton of Apple TV Plus's The Year Earth Changed. How are you guys doing?
Very good, thank you.
Very well, thank you.
Nice to be here.
It's nice to be here, even though we're still in our separated boxes a little bit. The earth has changed a bit, so we're doing a lot of these talks virtually, but it makes for pretty masterful documentary filmmaking. So my first question actually for Mike is that we are in a pandemic, things happen, it's May of 2020 and well March of 2020 or whenever it began, and this happens and you go, we need to see what the natural world is up to.
Yeah.
What was that spark? What happened? How did that begin?
Well, you're right. There wasn't. Nobody's absolutely sure when it was starting, but what was beginning to happen was these stories were coming out about people, these anecdotal stories about animals appearing in strange places and skies clearing, and we thought there is something obviously significantly happening that's never happened before. And also there was this extraordinary moment of people talking about this silence. They said, the world sounds different. And then it does sound different because I can hear a completely different soundscape. I can hear bird song. And we thought there is something significant going on here. And I have a good relationship with the commissioner at Apple TV in Europe. And we were talking about this and we said, this is a unique opportunity to record something, document something that I don't think has ever happened before. But if we do this, we're going to have to get out the blocks fast because it's happening fast. And she was fantastic. She said, right, do it, commissioned, go and do it. And luckily we had the network, because we work in the natural history unit, we have this network of contacts all over the world. And we literally said, right, phone everybody, press the button, tell us your stories, let's go. And of course, the adventure was nobody knew what would happen, which made it both scary, but in the end, exciting too.
I want to pose this next question to Alice and kind of piggybacking off of what Mike said about, our expansive contacts. Was everybody game for that in March of 2020 to go out there and just shoot? And what was that like? The logistics, your cross-continental, all these things are happening. How did you get that thing moving?
Well, actually, it's the BBC Natural History Unit is incredibly well placed, as Mike has hinted, because we have at any one time many in-country camera people all over the world. And actually, it was just a case of getting on the phone and saying, obviously under COVID restrictions, what can you do with your camera? Where can you go? What can you record? Can you record what we imagined was going to be the evidence of the much lighter tread of humans across the planet? And of course, we didn't get everything, but we had a much better crack at the whip than anybody else because we have these global networks. So on the one hand, we were able to do that and, scramble these camera people to, relatively local places for them. We have people in Kenya, we have people in South Africa, we had people in Australia, people all over the place, just get them to go out and shoot locally. But of course, the effect of that was that we had global filming taking place within a number of days. And then alongside that, sorry, because I'm moth in my room, alongside that, we had a very sort of nimble journalistic director who's used to, really kind of shooting from the hip and being very sort of dexterous about what he was going to do. And he realized, of course, he couldn't get on any planes. So he would find the right people to talk to. He would get in touch with the camera people, and quite often he would be directing whole sequences across the globe in the middle of the night for hours on end on his mobile phone, using WhatsApp and so on. I mean, it was a really extraordinary achievement. So both very, very personal and reactive, and also pan-global is the answer to that question.
I mean, I can say it almost gave me a heart attack, because I'm used to doing things like Planet Earth, which take 4 years to make. And so to do this in this time and to do it remotely was definitely a leap of faith. But it's amazing actually how that infrastructure that exists of these contacts really came up trumps. Yeah.
Was there any news, Alice, back to you out there for any surprises or things like that? You're like, hey, we're putting this together. Our director's on the phone. Was there any kind of funny quirks that happened with that situation?
I mean, I do remember our producer sending me some wonderful footage, hot off the press, of that enormous male leopard that decided just to wander into that luxury, completely deserted, of course, luxury safari lodge in Kenya, and just kind of blithely took over the place, settled himself down, near one of the sun lounges, and just sort of, behaved really quite out of character. These normally nocturnal animals. He was just wandering around during the day, just taking advantage of the fact that there was no people, saw it as an opportunity. And actually it was really, really quite unusual. I think I got almost a bigger shock seeing that as our cameraman did in the field. And if you've seen the film, you'll know what his reaction was.
It was a big old leopard, that.
That was pretty stunning. I wasn't really expecting that. Like, everything's so far away and nature's away from humans. And as soon as we reintrude on them, we're a little too close. Speaking about that, Mike, there's this scene with the whale researchers and also a little bit with the cheetah clubs and the cheetah mother, and they're just discussing the noise reduction and boats and people talking and chattering and all these things. Are there aspects beyond what we would normally think are intruding on nature and animal life that we as humans are just not even thinking about? Because that was shocking to me.
Yeah, well, I think that's in a way that's one of the themes of the show, is that it revealed the fact that we, so much of what we do has an impact on nature, which we don't think about because we're going about our everyday lives. And I suppose one of the things that you do when you watch the film is it takes you on a little bit of a journey as an audience, because it's quite thought-provoking, because obviously, as Alice said, we can't show every consequence of what happened or everything that happened during lockdown. But when you start to see some of these things, you think, well, if it affects that, well, does it affect this? And yes, how does my life, how do my actions cause these changes in the behavior of animals? And I think what's going to be really interesting in the next years is as the sort of scientists and the field workers start to look back on some of the observations they've made during this period, it's slightly rewriting the rule book about animal behavior, about what animals do, because we're seeing them in a way that we don't know. In many cases, we don't normally do that. And one of those scientists does say, this is a unique experiment. It's a chance to peer into the lives of the animals in a way that they would normally be without humans interfering them. And it's, we do interfere, we tread heavily, as Alice said, we tread heavily on the planet. And when we don't, this was an extraordinary opportunity to see what really goes on.
So I asked you guys a little bit about that shooting experience, the field, these big, huge teams and directors and shooters all across all 7 continents. But what was it like working with a particular part of the team, Sir David Attenborough, on this project during such a wild time? It was a game. It was a little more difficult than normal.
Well, obviously I talked to him about it quite early, about the ambition of it, and he said, well, that's a challenging thing to be doing. Inevitably trying to film in lockdown when you can't really film. But I explained to him what we're doing. He thought, no, that's a very interesting idea. And he said, this is him speaking now, I've noticed a difference. He lives in the heart of London. He said, my friends are telling me they're feeling a difference about their experience of nature. They're observing nature in a way they've never done before. They're connecting with nature in a way. And for him to say that, I thought was quite important. But when we finally finished and I showed him the film, he said, no, this is really remarkable. He said, I didn't expect you to be able to film as much as you have and to tell such a thought-provoking and complex woven story. So in a way, it was, he can't always, sometimes he's, doesn't always give me an easy time, but on this one, he said, no, this is great, very good, well done. Let me say the words, and he did. And of course, as ever, did a beautiful performance in one take, as he always does.
It was great, soothing to my ears.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, we've done a couple of interviews for the press when we were doing this, and because we are Brits, of course, and he's a very British voice, and this was to some of the American news people, and they were saying that voice, I just could listen to that voice forever. And he does bring this extraordinary level of engagement and authority to it, and so he was the perfect narrator for it. So I was delighted he could do it.
We'll just add to that. When I'm quite new to the Natural History Unit. I joined in lockdown, and this was my first experience of working with David Attenborough, and hearing that voice just coming right through the computer. I promptly burst into tears for the first 5 minutes. So I was completely hopeless. The first minute you hear it, you think it's true, because David, it does, as Mike says, lend that incredible authenticity and authority to this thing. So
because it obviously is based on scientific observation and documentary observation, but it is quite an emotional film. It's quite it's quite empathetic, because it makes you think about yourself and your relationship with nature, and that's where he's so perfect, because he has that ability to calibrate that so well. And if you write, the script is right as well, he manages to tread that path between giving you the scientific and the documentary hardcore information, but also woven into that is that empathetic engagement, which I think suited the story we were telling.
So as we make our way out of lockdown, is it a little bittersweet? It's funny that, Alice, you mentioned just coming over to natural history, having this great experience, and now I guess we're pulling back to a more normal sense of what the world could be in the next few months. Is it bittersweet to go away from that?
Well, I think whilst we are fast hurtling towards the easing of lockdown restrictions in the West, we shouldn't forget that much of the world is still heavily in lockdown and still dealing with tragedies on a grand scale. So I think that in itself is bittersweet. But the other thing is that, of course, towards the end of the film, we've got excerpts of our contributors who've been out in the field, seeing firsthand what happens to wildlife when we step back a bit, and what we can learn from that. And of course, there are things that we can learn, sometimes quite small steps. Our turtle researcher was just saying, like a few nightly shutdowns a few times a year when it's the key time for turtles nesting. We could do that. We could cluster. We could reduce sea traffic in places where humpbacks do need to communicate with their young. I mean, there are things that we can take away that we've seen this year that we can roll out every year. No, it wouldn't hurt anybody. And it's the bigger picture, of course, is it's all about coexistence. It's all about what can we do to allow wildlife to flourish and share our world properly with theirs. And I think we have had a few examples of that in this film that we can actually take from, and we should.
I wanted to nod to that because I love the example with the deer and impalas, and I thought that was an amazing way to show there is a way that we can actually live this way. When you guys were working with the directorial team, how important was it to show those moments of harmony?
Well, really important. I mean, first of all, it's completely unprecedented, and we're unlikely to ever see that kind of extreme again, where you've actually where you're used to seeing people and animals, like in Nara and Japan, where all of a sudden you've got nothing. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing. And we'll probably never be in that position again. It's so great to be able to capture that, so we can actually see, sometimes when you think you're doing, the tourists think that they're doing the deer a favor by giving them, rice bran biscuits. Actually, of course, they're fine without us. Animals are great at taking opportunities and great at living without our helping hand. So again, that's a lesson.
Mike, Alice mentioned this a bit about things that we can do. Have you heard of any governments, organizations, or any groups that are actively trying to maintain these sort of pockets or moments of respite for nature from us humans?
Well, I think it's probably a bit early to know exactly how that's going to play out, partly because we're still in the tumultuous time. You know, we haven't returned to normal yet. We're still playing that out. But not only are the stories that, you know, some of the ones that Alice has mentioned, you know, those have been the evidence that naturalists and scientists have been sort of looking for, to say, you know, for example, with ship noise, we know that there's a lot of sound pollution. Well, we suspected there's a lot of sound pollution in the ocean. It's a very noisy place. But what impact does it actually have? The scientific community can't say to the shipping world, stop your boats, we need to do an experiment. That will never happen. But an experiment now has happened. So now they've got a baseline. They can say, well, look, we now know what the world is like in this silent world. So I think what will happen is that, what I hope will happen is that all this knowledge and all this data and all these observations that have happened during this period, many of which, of course, we haven't covered, will start to gather momentum and gather some sort of mass, so that, you know, a proper, well thought out, effective policies can start to be created. Because, of course, we're not going to go back to the Stone Age. We're not going to return to, you know, we're not going to have a situation where there's no air flights, there's no boat travel. You know, we're going to, you know, it's an industrial society, so we're going to be like that. But how can we make the most effective decisions we can to try and harmonize, or to make the smallest impact on nature that we can? So I think what we fascinates, if we have this conversation in a year and a half's time or a year's time, I think we'll start to see some of the learning playing out in, I hope, in policy from both governmental and you know, in nature policy. So yeah, I certainly hope so.
I mean, we talk about it more broadly at that large scale, but, and this is my last question for both of you, and I'd love if you answer this. What do you hope the individual day-to-day people take away from this project after this whole experience?
I think that I think, you know, how quiet the streets were, even in you know, inner cities. You know, people noticing the change, people going outside, and first of all, really getting succor and you know, from nature, and feeling positive mental health benefits from actually going out into nature through lockdown, were huge. But also people noticing what they'd never noticed before. You know, when Mike refers to you know, people suddenly noticing birdsong, you know, where they hadn't noticed it before. And I think that's a very poignant but very simple idea, you know, that actually there was another side to lockdown, which is that we also stop and take a breath and think about, you know, what are the potential, what are the, you know, obviously it's a huge global tragedy for many people, but you know, there are some positives, and they're sometimes quite minimal, but you know, a lot. It was part of the daily story, wasn't it? You know, people would, you know, you'd hear about it on the radio, people would talk about it constantly, you know, about being able to hear the the natural sounds of our planet better, when there's fewer planes and just much less noise, much less traffic. I think that's a very poignant point about it, really.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all those things. I mean, I think it's hopeful. I think that I hope that people find it hopeful, but not naively so. And it shows that Mother Nature is incredibly resilient if you give Mother Nature the chance. But we shouldn't take it for granted, because you know that Mother Nature's under a lot of stresses. But it also, I think, as Alice was saying, it refreshes people's memory. I hope the film refreshes memory of some of the things they felt when it first happened, like hearing, as you say, hearing birdsong and just feeling that nature was more around you a bit, and the consequences of individual action. I mean, so many of the woes that the planet faces are the result of the aggregation of individual action. And this, I hope, might sort of reverse that sort of thinking that, oh, I can't do anything about it, it's too big a problem, it's too big an issue. But actually, small individual actions, if they're taken in the right way, can have disproportionately large positive consequences. So again, that goes back to that question earlier. We were sort of talking about, can we change policy, or can we get governments and organizations to rethink about how we can do that? and that's where you place your chips. You know, where we've only got a certain number of chips to place. Where do we place them so they have the maximum impact to do the most benefit to nature? And the last thing, I suppose, is a bit about reminding people of what there is to lose. That actually there's been a slight sort of drawing back of the veil, of the curtain, to show people nature, and it reminds people that this is extraordinary, but it is like a Jenga tower. You know, we're talking about people not being quite aware of our consequences, and you can keep pulling the bricks out and not really realizing what you're doing, but then one day the tower will fall down, and that would be a tragedy. So if people at the end of this film feel positive and hopeful and see that they can make a change, it's an opportunity to think, can we rebalance our relationship with nature just a bit, so that everything has a slightly better existence, because we'll all benefit. And that, I think that's the key message. It doesn't have to, it's not just for nature. Ultimately, every living thing, and that includes us, will benefit if we can just rebalance that relationship a bit better, live a bit more in harmony, as you said.
Can I just finally add to that, Brandon? One of the things that really struck us, I think, was when we were recording wildlife coming back, when we stepped back, well, I think we were all absolutely blown away by the speed at which it happened, and the ferocity, by the strength and the ferocity and that wildlife did come back. I mean, you know, opportunistic leopards is just one example, but within days we were seeing animals, wildlife everywhere, just really taking advantage very, very quickly. And I think that's incredibly hopeful. It doesn't take long and it doesn't take much to coexist, because wildlife is super strong and resilient and will take opportunities when it's there. So I think that is a hopeful thing as well. You know, we're always being told, you know, I think a lot of people feel sometimes quite depressed when they're watching natural history, because they think, well, we're just destroying the planet. And whilst that is true, it's also really enriching, and to see the speed and the strength at which wildlife does come back when we do stand back.
The Year Earth Change, an amazing, far-reaching project that hopefully gives us a little hope about what can happen in the future for our planet and for ourselves. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Mike, for joining us on Spring Showcase.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.